They did not realize they were losing the war when the first bombs fell. They did not realize it when cities were destroyed or when armies were pushed back. For many of them, the war was truly lost the moment they understood something far more disturbing. America was not just fighting harder. America was fighting differently. By the time this realization set in, no battlefield victory could erase it. At first, the difference was subtle. It appeared in small details that were easy to dismiss. Equipment that always worked. Supplies that arrived on time. Units that rotated without visible exhaustion. Orders that were clear, standardized, and followed by results. What seemed like efficiency soon revealed itself as something deeper. This was not improvisation. It was design. For enemy soldiers and officers accustomed to shortages, delays, and constant adaptation, this consistency was unsettling. War had taught them to expect friction. Machines failed. Communication broke down. Plans unraveled under pressure. Yet here was an opponent whose systems absorbed pressure without collapsing. The more stress applied, the more evident the difference became. The shock was not about a single weapon or invention. It was about integration. Radar did not exist in isolation. Aircraft did not operate independently. Logistics, intelligence, production, and command moved as parts of a single organism. When one element shifted, the others adjusted seamlessly. This level of coordination was not accidental. It was the result of a civilization mobilized for total war with industrial precision. What many failed to grasp at first was that this technological advantage was not reactive. It was anticipatory. American systems were built not to respond to crises, but to prevent them from escalating. Redundancy replaced improvisation. Standardization replaced chaos. Where others relied on exceptional individuals to compensate for failure, this system relied on structure to make failure rare. Enemy officers began to notice patterns they could not counter. Aircraft losses were replaced faster than they could be inflicted. Damaged equipment returned to service with alarming speed. Units withdrawn from the front reappeared re-equipped and reorganized. Nothing seemed final. Nothing seemed decisive. Every success felt temporary, immediately absorbed by a system designed to recover. This realization spread quietly. It did not come from propaganda or interrogation. It came from observation. Prisoners saw it in camps. Reconnaissance units saw it from a distance. Intelligence officers saw it in production numbers that no longer made sense. The war was no longer a contest of courage or sacrifice. It had become a contest of capacity. And capacity, once revealed, is terrifying. Because capacity does not get tired. It does not lose morale, it does not panic, it compounds. Each month made the gap wider. Each engagement reinforced the same conclusion. This was not an enemy that could be outlasted. This was an enemy that would simply continue, improving with time. Attempts to counter this advantage only deepened the shock. New weapons were rushed into service without infrastructure to support them. Complex machines were fielded without maintenance capacity. Innovation became desperate rather than strategic. Meanwhile, American technology did not arrive as miracles, but as reliable tools embedded in a functioning system. For many on the opposing side, this was the moment the war changed shape. Victory was no longer imagined as a breakthrough. It became imagined as a miracle. And miracles, by definition, are not plans. Once that thought takes root, everything else follows. The war was still being fought. Battles still raged. Men still died. But beneath the violence, a quieter realization had already settled in. This was not a war that could be won by endurance alone. It was a war decided by systems, scale, and a level of organization that could not be replicated in time. From that moment on, the outcome was no longer uncertain. It was only delayed. The deeper this realization went, the more unsettling it became. What enemy planners had underestimated was not a specific invention, but the environment that produced those inventions at scale. American technology was not rare, experimental, or fragile. It was standardized, repeatable, and supported by an industrial base that treated war production as a problem of management rather than desperation. This distinction mattered more than any individual breakthrough. Factories did not function as isolated centers of output. They were nodes in a coordinated network. Components moved predictably. Quality control reduced failure before equipment ever reached the front. Training manuals matched the machines they described. Replacement parts were interchangeable. Nothing depended on improvisation. Nothing depended on luck. This removed an entire layer of uncertainty that other nations had learned to accept as inevitable. Enemy intelligence officers struggled to interpret what they were seeing. Production numbers exceeded plausible limits. Losses did not translate into weakness. Bombing campaigns disrupted facilities, but output recovered faster than anticipated. Entire categories of equipment appeared in quantities that defied traditional models of wartime strain. The conclusion was unavoidable. This system was not operating near its breaking point. It was operating within design parameters. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. In most wars, attrition carries an implicit promise. The longer the conflict lasts, the weaker both sides become. Here, that assumption collapsed. Time favored one side disproportionately. Each month of continued fighting did not exhaust American capacity. It refined it. Processes improved. Bottlenecks were identified and removed. Scale increased efficiency instead of degrading it. This was especially visible in logistics. Supplies arrived not as desperate shipments but as scheduled flows. Fuel, ammunition, food, and medical equipment moved through the system with minimal interruption. Units did not pause to wait for resupply. They planned around its certainty. For opposing forces accustomed to scarcity-shaping tactics, this reliability changed the nature of combat entirely. Technological integration amplified this effect. Radar improved coordination. Communications reduced uncertainty. Intelligence shortened decision cycles. Each improvement reinforced the others. Technology did not replace human judgment. It supported it, reducing friction and error. The result was not automation, but confidence. Commanders could act knowing their decisions would be supported consistently. Attempts to disrupt this system often produced the opposite effect. Pressure exposed redundancy. Damage revealed depth. Each attack became a stress test that the system passed publicly. The more it was challenged, the clearer its resilience became. This visibility mattered. It removed hope that a single decisive blow could alter the balance. For those observing from the other side, the implication was devastating. Victory no longer depended on bravery or tactical brilliance alone. It required matching an industrial and organizational capacity that could not be built under fire. Even perfect execution could not compensate for structural disadvantage. The war had moved beyond the reach of heroism. This realization did not arrive as panic. It arrived as calculation. Officers stopped asking how to defeat the enemy and began asking how long resistance could be sustained. Strategies shifted from winning to delaying. Operations were designed to buy time, not change outcomes. The goal quietly transformed from victory to survival. Once this shift occurred, the war entered a new phase. One side fought to conclude, the other fought to endure. And endurance against a system that grows stronger with time is not a strategy. It is a countdown. By the time this became widely understood, there was no path back. The difference was no longer technological alone. It was existential. As this existential gap became impossible to ignore, the war began to feel asymmetrical in a way no doctrine had prepared for. Enemy commanders were trained to counter tactics, formations, and weapons. They were not trained to counter a system that improved faster than it could be damaged. This was not a battlefield problem. It was a structural one. What disturbed observers most was not speed alone, but learning. American forces absorbed lessons from failure with remarkable efficiency. A mistake identified in one theater translated into changes across others. Procedures were revised, manuals updated, training adjusted, and equipment modified. Not months later, but in near real time. Failure did not accumulate. It informed. For opposing forces, failure carried a different weight. Losses were permanent. Adjustments were slow. New equipment required retraining that could not be completed before the next engagement. Innovations arrived fragmented, unsupported by doctrine or supply. Each improvement created new dependencies that could not be sustained. Progress came with fragility attached. This difference reshaped morale. Soldiers do not only fight with weapons, they fight with expectations. Knowing that losses would be replaced quickly changed how American units operated under pressure. Risk could be calculated. Initiative could be encouraged. Recovery was assumed. On the other side, every loss felt final. Every failure narrowed the future. Caution replaced creativity. Survival replaced ambition. The technological shock was therefore cumulative. It was reinforced with each encounter. Aircraft returning to service within days. Vehicles repaired and redeployed with standardized parts. Communications restored quickly after disruption. Nothing stayed broken for long. The war effort did not stall. It adapted. Even moments of apparent vulnerability revealed strength. When supply lines stretched across oceans, they held. When fronts expanded rapidly, coordination followed. Scale did not introduce chaos, it produced order. This contradicted every historical precedent. Traditionally, size complicates command. Here, size simplified it through standardization and process. Enemy analysts struggled to explain this phenomenon without resorting to denial. Some framed it as temporary excess. Others believed morale would eventually crack. But the evidence accumulated relentlessly. Reports repeated the same observations from different fronts, independent of one another. The pattern was consistent because the system was consistent. This consistency undermined hope in a way no defeat could. Battles can be refought. Positions can be regained. But once a system demonstrates that it can sustain pressure indefinitely while improving, the future narrows sharply. Resistance becomes symbolic rather than strategic. The psychological effect extended beyond the front lines. Civilian planners, industrial managers, and political leaders confronted the same conclusion from different angles. Production targets became impossible to match. Resource shortages worsened. Promises lost credibility. The narrative of eventual parity collapsed under measurable reality. At this stage, the war was no longer being lost incrementally. It had crossed a threshold. The gap had become qualitative rather than quantitative. It was not about having more. It was about functioning differently. And differences of function cannot be closed by sacrifice alone. Once this was understood, time itself became the enemy. Each day that passed widened the distance. Each delay benefited the system designed to scale. The war could continue, but it could not reverse. This was the moment when many realized that the conflict was no longer a contest of nations, but a confrontation between systems, and only one of those systems was built to endure modern war at full intensity. As the war entered this phase, the human response to technological imbalance became increasingly visible. Soldiers and officers began to internalize a new reality. Effort no longer translated into leverage. No matter how precisely an operation was planned or how bravely it was executed, the results failed to accumulate. Success dissolved into the larger system opposing them, absorbed and neutralized with unnerving efficiency. This realization altered behavior in subtle but decisive ways. Risk-taking declined. Initiative narrowed. Decisions became defensive rather than creative. Commanders avoided bold maneuvers, not because they lacked courage, but because courage no longer promised payoff. When outcomes are predetermined by structure rather than circumstance, individual action loses its strategic meaning. On the American side, the opposite dynamic took hold. Confidence did not manifest as arrogance but as predictability. Units trusted that support would arrive. Pilots trusted that damaged aircraft would be repaired or replaced. Infantry trusted that wounded comrades would receive care. This trust reduced friction at every level. People acted faster because they did not need to hedge against systemic failure. Technology reinforced this trust continuously. Communication systems shortened the distance between decision and execution. Intelligence reduced uncertainty. Standardized equipment eliminated improvisation. Training aligned perfectly with reality. None of these elements were revolutionary in isolation. Their power came from coherence. Each part strengthened the others, producing a force that felt less like an army and more like an integrated process. For opposing forces, this coherence was deeply demoralizing. Warfare traditionally offers moments of disruption, windows where chaos can be exploited. Here, chaos was temporary. Disruption triggered response rather than collapse. The system behaved less like a fragile machine and more like a resilient organism, capable of absorbing shock and returning to equilibrium. This forced a re-evaluation of what resistance even meant. If the enemy could recover faster than damage could be inflicted, then resistance became symbolic. It delayed, but it did not alter. It inflicted cost, but it did not change trajectory. Over time, This distinction weighed heavily on those tasked with continuing the fight. The psychological toll of this asymmetry spread beyond combatants. Engineers, planners, and logisticians confronted constraints they could not solve. Production targets were revised downward. Maintenance cycles stretched. Quality declined. Each adjustment reinforced the same conclusion. The gap was widening, not narrowing. What made this especially difficult to confront was that it could not be blamed on a single failure or decision. There was no catastrophic mistake to correct, no enemy breakthrough to counter. The disadvantage was systemic. It existed everywhere, all the time, across every domain, and systems cannot be outmaneuvered by tactics alone. This recognition quietly reshaped the meaning of time. Previously, time was seen as an ally. The longer the war continued, the greater the chance of exhaustion on both sides. Now time favored only one system. Every additional month strengthened the opponent while eroding internal capacity. Delay ceased to be a strategy. It became a liability. At this stage, the war persisted not because victory was believed possible, but because collapse had not yet been formalized. Fighting continued out of obligation, habit, and fear of consequences, not expectation of success. The conflict had entered its final psychological phase. The enemy was no longer feared primarily for his weapons, but for his continuity. He did not need to rush. He did not need to gamble. He only needed to continue doing what his system was designed to do. And once that reality is understood, the end of the war becomes not a question of if, but of when. As this understanding spread, the war effort on the opposing side entered a state of managed decline. It did not collapse suddenly, nor did it unravel in visible chaos. Instead, it contracted inward. Objectives became smaller. Ambitions narrowed. Plans were designed not to win, but to avoid disaster for a little longer. The language of command subtly shifted from progress to preservation. This shift was reflected in how resources were allocated. Instead of being concentrated for decisive action, they were dispersed defensively. Instead of enabling movement, they were used to slow inevitable advances. Every decision carried the weight of scarcity. Every operation risked exposing weakness elsewhere. The system no longer expanded. It reacted. Meanwhile, American technological momentum continued to accelerate. Production lines did not merely replace losses, they improved outputs. Later models corrected earlier flaws. Training incorporated battlefield feedback continuously. Coordination between air, land, and sea tightened. What had begun as advantage matured into dominance through refinement rather than escalation. This refinement was especially visible in logistics. The ability to project power across vast distances without breakdown contradicted historical assumptions about overextension. Supply chains stretched, but did not snap. Ports adapted. Transportation routes diversified. Redundancy prevented single points of failure from becoming decisive. What should have been vulnerabilities became strengths. For those watching from the other side, this endurance shattered the last remaining illusions. Traditional counters failed to produce lasting effect. Bombing disrupted but did not paralyze. Attrition wounded but did not weaken. Each attempt to impose cost revealed a deeper reserve beneath the surface. The enemy was not fighting on the edge. He was operating within capacity. This realization stripped the war of its emotional volatility. Panic subsided, not because hope returned, but because the outcome no longer demanded interpretation. It was visible, clear, measurable. The future stopped being debated and began being accepted. Soldiers adapted accordingly. Survival instincts replaced strategic ambition. Initiative became localized, focused on immediate safety rather than long-term gain. Risk was avoided not out of fear, but out of calculation. When the system you face absorbs loss faster than you can impose it, restraint becomes rational. This rational withdrawal did not require orders. It emerged organically. Across different fronts and units, similar behavioral patterns appeared independently. Caution increased. Engagements shortened. Objectives were abandoned quietly. The war effort hollowed from the inside while maintaining outward form. American forces recognized this change intuitively. Pressure was maintained without urgency. Advances were methodical. There was no need for dramatic breakthroughs. Consistency did the work. Each successful operation reinforced the same conclusion on the opposing side. Resistance no longer influenced the outcome. At this stage, technology ceased to be perceived as equipment and became perceived as inevitability. It was no longer about planes, ships, or radios. It was about the impossibility of catching up. The war had moved beyond the reach of willpower. Once that boundary is crossed, the end is not sudden. It is procedural. As the war moved toward its final phase, the technological imbalance no longer needed to be proven. It had been internalized. What once shocked now felt inevitable. The opposing side no longer asked how to counter American systems, but how to endure their consequences. The conflict had transitioned from a struggle for advantage into a process of managed defeat. This internal shift reshaped every layer of decision-making. Strategic planning became conservative. Innovation slowed. New projects were proposed with the unspoken understanding that they would arrive too late to matter. Resources were allocated to delay collapse rather than prevent it. The future was no longer imagined as changeable, only survivable. Morale followed the same trajectory. It did not break dramatically, it thinned. Confidence drained away quietly, replaced by calculation. Soldiers continued to perform their duties, but without expectation. Officers issued orders knowing they would not alter the outcome. The war effort persisted through inertia rather than belief. What made this stage irreversible was the clarity of comparison. American technology did not merely outperform, it normalized reliability. When reliability becomes routine, it removes hope of disruption. There were no lucky breaks to wait for, no catastrophic failures to exploit. The system functioned as designed day after day across continents. This reliability had a profound psychological effect. Uncertainty is the fuel of resistance. When uncertainty disappears, resistance loses its emotional foundation. The enemy no longer feared sudden defeat or hoped for sudden reversal. He expected continuation, and continuation favored only one side. For American forces, this expectation produced calm rather than urgency. Operations were planned methodically. Risk was managed, not embraced. There was no need to gamble when time itself was an ally. The system rewarded patience, consistency, and coordination. Victory unfolded as a process, not an event. For those on the receiving end, this calm was deeply unsettling. It suggested not only strength but confidence in inevitability. A force that does not rush is a force that does not doubt. Each deliberate movement reinforced the same conclusion. The outcome was no longer contested. This realization reached beyond the battlefield. Civilian populations sensed it. Industrial centers felt it. Political leadership confronted it through numbers that could not be argued away. Production curves diverged permanently. Resource shortages intensified. Promises lost credibility. The narrative of endurance collapsed under measurable reality. At this point, the war existed largely as obligation. Fighting continued because stopping carried consequences, not because continuing held promise. The distinction mattered. Obligation sustains motion, but it cannot sustain purpose. Purpose had already been lost to comparison. Technology in this sense did not simply defeat the enemy. It removed his future. It closed off pathways that might have led to recovery or reversal. The system opposing him did not need to destroy every capability. It only needed to continue functioning, and continue it did. By this stage, the technological shock had transformed into something more final: acceptance. The opposing side no longer measured the war in terms of battles won or lost, but in terms of time remaining. Time until cities could no longer function. Time until production collapsed entirely. Time until the system could no longer hide its exhaustion behind discipline and obligation. This acceptance did not manifest as surrender. It manifested as restraint. Large risks were avoided. Complex operations were postponed indefinitely. Commanders chose predictability over ambition, not because ambition was dangerous, but because it was pointless. The war had reached a phase where effort no longer correlated with influence. American technological dominance reinforced this dynamic daily. New equipment appeared not as a surprise but as confirmation. Each improvement arrived integrated, supported, and immediately effective. Nothing required explanation. Nothing needed adjustment under fire. The system absorbed innovation seamlessly as if it had been waiting for it. For enemy soldiers, This was the most demoralizing realization of all. It was not that America had better technology. It was that America had built a process that made better technology inevitable. Each generation of equipment was not an exception, but an expectation. The future belonged to the side that could guarantee improvement over time. This understanding reshaped the meaning of resistance. Resistance no longer aimed to change the outcome. It aimed to preserve dignity, order, and survival within an outcome already understood. This is a crucial distinction. Wars are not always ended by defeat. Sometimes they are ended by recognition. That recognition spread quietly across fronts and institutions. It did not require coordination. Different units reached the same conclusions independently, guided by the same observations. The pattern was universal because the system they faced was universal. Wherever it appeared, it behaved the same way. The final months of the war reflected this reality. Fighting continued, but without illusion. Movements were cautious. Engagements were limited. The future no longer felt open. It felt closed. What remained was execution of an ending already written. From the American perspective, this phase required discipline rather than heroics. There was no need to accelerate recklessly or seek symbolic victories. The system rewarded patience. Each day of continued function brought the conclusion closer without requiring dramatic escalation. The war moved forward under its own weight. Technology at this point was no longer perceived as an advantage. It was perceived as environment. It defined the conditions under which all action occurred, and within that environment, only one outcome was possible. Once war becomes environment rather than contest, it has already been decided. By the time the war reached its formal conclusion, the technological shock that once stunned the enemy had already done its quiet work. What began as surprise had become understanding. What began as understanding had become inevitability. The end did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as alignment between reality and recognition. This is why the final phase of the war often appears strangely restrained. There is less desperation than expected, less belief in last-minute reversals, less faith in miracles. Not because courage vanished, but because clarity replaced illusion. The enemy no longer fought an opponent he hoped to exhaust. He faced a system designed to endure, adapt, and expand under pressure. American victory in this sense was not defined by any single battle, weapon, or invention. It was defined by the construction of a system that removed uncertainty from war itself, a system where logistics were predictable, technology was integrated, learning was continuous, and failure was absorbed rather than amplified. Against such a system, endurance ceased to be a path to victory. This is the lesson that emerged slowly, painfully, and irrevocably for those on the opposing side. The war was not lost because of one mistake or one decisive encounter. It was lost because the conflict had shifted to a level where sacrifice could no longer compensate for structure. Willpower could no longer substitute for capacity. History often celebrates moments of drama. It prefers explosions, breakthroughs, and decisive confrontations. But the true end of this war unfolded differently. It unfolded in spreadsheets and supply chains, in maintenance schedules and training manuals, in factories that did not stop and systems that did not break. The enemy understood this before the world did. He understood it when every setback was replaced faster than it could be imposed. He understood it when disruption failed to create collapse. He understood it when time itself became an ally to the other side and an enemy to him. By then, the war no longer required interpretation. It required closure. This is how the conflict truly ended. Not with a final blow, but with the recognition that the future belonged to the side that could build, sustain, and improve a system under pressure. Once that recognition settled in, everything else followed naturally. The war ended not when the last shot was fired, but when one side realized it was fighting a different kind of war altogether. And by the time that realization arrived, the outcome was already decided.